In this section, we will examine a variety of other topics related to compression. We will look at some specialized types of compressors and other dynamic processors, advanced techniques for using compressors, and some special applications of compressors which are unusual enough to warrant special examination. A limiter is a special type of compressor. Unlike a normal compressor, which may allow the input signal to exceed the threshold, a limiter will never let this happen. The input signal will always remain below the threshold no matter what. Theoretically speaking, a limiter is equivalent to a compressor with an instantaneous attack, a ratio of infinity to 1, and a hard knee. Many limiters are differentiated from normal compressors by the presence of a look-ahead feature. A normal compressor can only react to audio as it arrives, which means that if it arrives at a sudden peak, it will have to clamp down on it very quickly, possibly distorting the audio signal in the process. With look-ahead, the limiter sees a few milliseconds into the future so that when a sudden peak is about to arrive, the limiter can begin clamping down ahead of time, resulting in a smoother and more transparent effect. Limiters have a variety of uses. In mixing, the most important of these uses is the transparent removal of peaks. With a good quality limiter, sufficiently brief peaks can often be reduced or removed with little or no audible effect on the sound. This increases the available headroom of the music and it allows it to be made louder. A limiter can also be used in any context where you are looking for extreme compression. In these cases, a limiter is simpler to configure than a compressor, and due to look-ahead, can often produce a smoother result. One variation of the standard compressor usage paradigm is the use of multiple compressors on the same sound, chained one after another. This is called serial compression, and there are plenty of situations in which it's a good idea. Often several compressors working together as a team can get the job done better than one compressor. Generally, when using serial compression, each compressor should be doing a different job. For instance, you might have one compressor with a fast attack and a high threshold to tame the peaks, and another compressor with a slow attack and a low threshold to reduce the dynamic range. There's very little reason to have two compressors on a channel that have almost the same settings. Just delete the second one and increase the ratio on the first one, and theoretically you'll have the same effect. Another variation on standard compressor usage is parallel compression. Parallel compression involves sending a sound through a fairly heavy-handed compressor and then mixing the dry signal together with the compressed signal. Parallel compression is a gentle effect that reduces dynamic range from the bottom up rather than the top down. Rather than bringing down the peaks, it brings up the low-level details. It is often applied to drum and percussion group channels, but you can use it on any track where you want to bring out the details while preserving the peaks. Some compressors offer a sidechain input. This is a secondary audio input that allows you to use a signal other than the input signal to control the action of the compressor. The second signal is called the sidechain signal. A sidechain compressor behaves quite differently from a normal compressor. Rather than responding to peaks in the input signal, it responds to peaks in the sidechain signal. The dynamics of the sidechain signal are used to shape the dynamics of the input signal. If the sidechain signal goes over the threshold, then the input will be reduced accordingly. Effectively, sidechain compression allows you to cause the input signal to get out of the way of the sidechain signal. It is therefore useful for creating space in a mix. For example, subtly sidechaining the background instrumentation of a song to the vocal line, causing the background instrumentation to fall back a bit when the vocals come in, can give the vocals more room to breathe while keeping the mix nice and full. Sidechaining a bass line to a kick drum can also be effective. It can get the bass line out of the way of the kick so that it can really kick without taking too much away from the power of the bass line. Furthermore, a carefully adjusted sidechain compressor can cause the kick and bass, when they hit together, to fuse into one unified kick and bass sound, which can sound very nice. Though sidechaining can be used to subtly create space in a mix, it can also be used as an artistic tool. With long release times and/or high ratios, sidechain compression can cause a dramatic ducking effect. This effect is often used in modern house and techno music, where much of the instrumentation may be sidechained to the kick drum, causing the music to rhythmically pulse and throb in time with the kick. A similar effect can be achieved with a single normal compressor on the master bus. Finally, sidechain compression can be used to reduce the level of sibilance, such as consonants S and T, in vocal recordings, a process known as de-essing. This is frequently desirable as these consonants can sometimes be annoyingly loud. To de-ess your vocal, set up a sidechain compression routing where the sidechain signal is simply the input signal sent through an EQ. In the EQ, boost the sibilance range, which is around 2 to 8 kHz. Now the sidechain compressor should reduce the gain of the input signal whenever there is significant sibilance. Like a gate, an expander is not a compressor. Conceptually speaking, an expander does the same thing as a compressor, except that rather than reducing the dynamic range, it increases the dynamic range. When the sound rises above the threshold, the expander amplifies it by an amount proportional to the ratio. Many compressors are also expanders. To use a compressor as an expander, simply set the ratio to a value below 1. One application of compression that deserves some special attention is the shaping of percussive sounds. This type of compression should be applied to single percussive sounds, such as a snare drum, a cymbal, a guitar, piano, etc. It should not be applied to mixed drum kits. If you wish to apply this technique to your drums, use a separate compressor for each drum sound. There are two separate cases for shaping percussive sounds, to bring out the attack and to bring out the body. We will consider each of these cases individually. To bring out the body, set up a compressor with a slow attack and a moderate or fast release. Set the threshold below the level of the body of the sound. Set the ratio to taste, but fairly low is usually best. This technique works because the slow compressor attack leaves the attack of the sound intact, and the compressor then clamps down on the body, which is still above the threshold. It brings out the attack by reducing the level of the body. You can also bring out the attack by using an expander. Set up a fast attack and a moderate or fast release, and set the threshold above the body of the sound. Set the ratio to taste, but fairly low is usually best. To bring out the body, set up a compressor with a very fast attack. Set the release as fast as it will go without causing distortion. Set the threshold just above the highest point of the body. Set the ratio to taste. This technique works by clamping down on the attack of a sound. It brings out the body by reducing the levels of the attack. You can further bring out the body of the sound by using an additional compressor to compress the body as a serial compression technique. Parallel compression is also very well suited to the task of bringing out the body of a percussive sound. Simply set up the compressor to completely flatten the attack out of existence, and then use the level faders to adjust the balance between the attack and the body, turning up the compressed channel to increase the level of the body. One of the cool things about compression is its ability to manipulate grooves. By shaping the dynamics of the music, it shapes the patterns of emphasis, and by shaping said patterns, it shapes the groove of the music. Now we will look at one way to manipulate grooves. This method will usually be applied to a full mix, but sometimes it might also be applied to a group channel. The idea is that you have one or two loud drum parts, usually the kick drum and possibly the snare drum, which are routed along with a bunch of other elements to a channel being compressed. You set up a compressor on the channel and set the threshold so that it is triggered by the drums and not much else. For this technique to work, the drums must constitute the highest peaks in the music. Set a hard knee, fast attack, slow release, and moderate ratio. Now turn up the drums. They will begin to trigger the compressor more intensely, and the slow release will cause the rest of the music to pump. The pumping, if done well, will be fairly subtle. You should hear an obvious difference when you toggle bypass on the compressor, but you probably won't be able to actually hear the pumping unless you listen very closely. If you are going to put a pumping compressor on your master bus, or really any compressor on your master bus, it is generally best to put it there fairly early on, and then mix into it. If you put it on after the fact, then your results will not be as good, because the compressor will have messed up a bunch of mixing decisions that you made previously. If you make those decisions with the compressor on, then you will compensate for the effects of the compressor and get good results. A multiband compressor is an elaboration on the basic concept of compression. A multiband compressor works by splitting the input signal into multiple frequency bands, usually 3, and then sending each to a separate compressor and then mixing the signals together again after compression. So in the usual case, you have 3 compressors, one for bass, one for mid-range, and one for treble. You can set the precise frequency range that each of these bands affects. Multiband compressors were originally invented to be used as a mastering tool, but they do come in handy from time to time in mixing. They are useful for manipulating material that is already mixed together, such as drum loops. They can also produce interesting results when shaping percussive sounds. More generally, they can be put to a variety of creative uses, such as reaching inside of a sound and shaping its dynamics at that level can produce quite startling results. Multiband compressors are also useful for evening out instrumental performances that would otherwise be difficult to correct. For instance, if you have a guitar part that has the occasionally excessive twangy and sharp plucked note, you can smooth it out by applying a compressor in the treble range and leaving the rest untouched. Finally, multiband compressors provide a good method for de-essing. By setting one of the frequency bands to target the sibilance range around 2 to 8 kHz, you can isolate the sibilance and compress it by itself.